January 19, 1988, Forst Zinna, East Germany, 7:23 p.m. The evening darkness has settled over the pine forests of Brandenburg, 40 miles southwest of East Berlin. Snow lies thick on the ground, muffling sound, turning the landscape into a monochrome study in black and white. Through this winter silence, a passenger train races northward at nearly 90 kilometers per hour. Its headlight cutting through the darkness, its engine pulling 6 coaches filled with commuters heading home after a day's work in the factories and offices of the German Democratic Republic. In the lead locomotive, the engineer maintains his speed on the familiar route. He has run this line hundreds of times, knows every curve and grade, every signal and crossing. The track ahead appears clear, the signals show green, the visibility is adequate, despite the winter weather, and there is no reason to expect anything unusual on this Tuesday evening run. But 200 meters ahead, invisible in the darkness beyond the reach of the train's headlight, something that should never be on a railway track sits motionless across the rails. It is not a stalled vehicle, or a fallen tree or debris blown by winter winds. It is a T-64 main battle tank, 40 tons of Soviet armor, equipped with a 125 mm smoothbore cannon and composite armor, designed to withstand anti-tank rounds. The tank's crew has been trying desperately to move it for the past several minutes, but the machine refuses to respond. The engine runs, but the transmission will not engage. The tank sits immobile, straddling both tracks with a passenger train bearing down at 90 km per hour. The crew hears the train whistle in the distance. They redouble their efforts, trying every technique they know to get the tank moving. They try shifting gears, manipulating controls, even attempting to rock the vehicle. Nothing works. The tank remains frozen in place, an immovable object about to meet an unstoppable force. At 7:23 p.m., the express train rounds a gentle curve, and the engineer suddenly sees something massive blocking the track ahead. He has perhaps 3 seconds to react. His hand slams the emergency brake lever, engaging the brake system with a scream of metal on metal. But 40-ton trains traveling at 90 km per hour cannot stop in 3 seconds or even in the 200 meters remaining before impact. The laws of physics are absolute and unforgiving. The locomotive strikes the T-64 tank with the force of hundreds of tons moving at highway speed. The impact is catastrophic. The tank, despite its 40 tons of mass, is struck with such force that it is hurled off the tracks and crushed against an adjacent building. The locomotive's front end crumples, the lead wheels derail, and the engine begins to tip. The passenger coaches behind, still moving at tremendous speed, accordion into each other and into the derailed locomotive. Metal tears, glass shatters, wooden coach bodies splinter. The train, which moments before had been a smoothly running transportation system, becomes a twisted mass of wreckage scattered across the tracks and the surrounding area. Inside the coaches, passengers experience a violence beyond description. Those in the forward cars are thrown forward with lethal force as the train decelerates from 90 km per hour to 0 in a fraction of a second. Bodies are hurled against seats, walls and each other. The structural collapse of the coaches crushes passengers where they sit. Others are thrown through windows or trapped in twisted metal as the cars fold and crumple. The collision occurs in the heart of Forst Zinna, a massive Soviet military complex that has dominated this region of East Germany for decades. The base, sprawling across hundreds of hectares of Brandenburg forest, is one of the largest Soviet installations outside the USSR. It houses thousands of Soviet soldiers, hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles, and serves as a primary training facility for tank crews destined for deployment across the Warsaw Pact. The railway line that the express train was traveling runs directly through the base, carrying not just military traffic but also civilian passengers, whose daily commutes take them past tank depots, barracks and training grounds. This collision between military operations and civilian transportation, between the machinery of Cold War confrontation and the ordinary routines of East German daily life, has just produced one of the worst rail disasters in German history. The death toll will eventually reach 6 people killed and 33 injured. But the impact of this disaster extends far beyond the immediate casualties. It exposes the tensions and contradictions of life in the German Democratic Republic, where Soviet military operations took precedence over civilian safety, where information was controlled and suppressed, where the machinery of war shared space with ordinary life in ways that would have been unthinkable in the West. This is the story of the Forst Zinna rail disaster, how a tank ended up on a railway track, why a train could not stop in time, and what this catastrophe revealed about the nature of Soviet occupation, East German society, and the deadly consequences when military priorities override civilian safety. It is the story of a collision that was both accident and inevitability, the product of specific mechanical failures and broader systemic problems that made disaster not just possible but almost inevitable. Forst Zinna was not always a Soviet military base. The complex has a history stretching back to the 19th century, reflecting the militaristic traditions of Prussia and Germany. Understanding this history is essential to understanding how, by 1988, a civilian railway line ran directly through an active military installation, where tanks trained daily. The site was originally established in the 1860s as a Prussian military training area. The location was chosen for practical reasons. The forests and open areas of Brandenburg provided space for military exercises, while the proximity to Berlin allowed relatively easy transport of troops and supplies. The area was sparsely populated, which minimized conflicts with civilian landowners and reduced the security concerns inherent in military operations near population centers. In the late 19th century, as German military power expanded, Forst Zinna grew into a significant installation. Barracks were constructed to house soldiers. Training facilities were built for infantry and artillery practice. The German Imperial Army used the base to prepare troops for the wars that would define the early 20th century. German soldiers trained at Forst Zinna before deploying to fight in World War I, learning the tactics and disciplines that would be tested in the trenches of France and Belgium. Between the wars, during the Weimar Republic era, Forst Zinna continued as a military facility, though the Treaty of Versailles had severely limited Germany's military capabilities. The German military used the base within the constraints imposed by the treaty, maintaining training facilities even as Germany was prohibited from maintaining large armed forces or certain categories of weapons. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Forst Zinna took on renewed importance as Hitler's regime began its massive rearmament program in defiance of Versailles. The base expanded significantly. New barracks were built, training facilities were modernized, and the area was used intensively to prepare the Wehrmacht for the wars of conquest that Hitler planned. German soldiers trained at Forst Zinna before invading Poland, France and eventually the Soviet Union. The base became a cog in the Nazi war machine, producing trained soldiers for the conflicts that would devastate Europe. But Forst Zinna's role in German military history ended abruptly in April 1945 when Soviet forces advancing westward through Germany captured the area. The base fell to the Red Army with minimal resistance as the Third Reich collapsed. What had been a German military installation for nearly a century became, overnight, a Soviet possession. The Soviets immediately recognized the value of Forst Zinna. The facilities were extensive and well built. The location was strategic in the heart of what would become the Soviet zone of occupation, with good rail and road connections to Berlin and other major cities. As the Cold War solidified and Germany was divided into East and West, Forst Zinna became one of the Soviet Union's primary military bases in the German Democratic Republic. The transformation was rapid and comprehensive. Soviet forces took over the German barracks and facilities. They brought in their own equipment, first the T-34 tanks and IS-2 heavy tanks that had won the war, later the more modern T-54, T-55 and eventually T-64 tanks. They expanded the base significantly, constructing additional buildings, improving infrastructure and creating one of the largest Soviet military complexes outside the USSR. By the 1980s, Forst Zinna had grown into a massive installation covering hundreds of hectares. The base housed elements of the Soviet 20th Guards Army, which was responsible for Soviet military operations in East Germany. Thousands of Soviet soldiers lived and trained at Forst Zinna at any given time. The base included extensive barracks, administrative buildings, maintenance facilities for armored vehicles, ammunition storage, training grounds, and all the infrastructure needed to support a major military force. The tank training facilities at Forst Zinna were particularly significant. The base served as a primary location for training Soviet tank crews who would be deployed throughout the Warsaw Pact. Young Soviet conscripts arrived at Forst Zinna knowing little about tanks and left as trained crewmen ready to operate the sophisticated armored vehicles that formed the backbone of Soviet military power in Europe. The training was intensive and realistic, involving not just classroom instruction but extensive practical exercises with actual tanks operating across the base's training grounds. This meant that on any given day dozens of tanks might be moving around Forst Zinna, driving on roads within the base, maneuvering across training areas, being transported between facilities. The base was effectively a small city dedicated to armored warfare where tanks were as common as cars might be in a civilian town, but Forst Zinna was not an isolated military facility separated from civilian life. This was where the peculiar circumstances that led to the 1988 disaster had their roots. A railway line, an ordinary civilian railway line carrying passenger and freight traffic, ran directly through the middle of the base. The railway had existed long before the Soviets arrived. It had been built in the 19th century as part of the expansion of German rail networks and had always run through this area, even when it was a Prussian and then German military training ground. When the Soviets took over Forst Zinna, they made a decision that in hindsight seems almost incomprehensible. They allowed the civilian railway to continue operating through the middle of their military base. Passenger trains carrying East German commuters passed daily through a complex where Soviet tanks trained, where ammunition was stored, where military operations that were supposed to be secret from Western intelligence were conducted. The railway even had a station within the base, Bahnhof Forst Zinna, where civilians could board and disembark trains while surrounded by Soviet military facilities. This decision reflected both practical considerations and the political realities of the Soviet occupation of East Germany. Practically, rerouting the railway would have been expensive and disruptive. The existing line provided important transportation links for the region, and East Germany's struggling economy could not easily afford to build new rail lines simply to accommodate Soviet security preferences. Politically, the East German government had to balance Soviet military interests against the needs of its own population, who depended on the railway for transportation. The compromise was to allow the railway to continue operating while implementing security measures and procedures intended to prevent conflicts between rail traffic and military operations. These procedures included requirements that tank movements across the railway tracks be coordinated with train schedules, that military units notify railway officials before moving heavy equipment across the tracks, and that guards be posted at crossings when military vehicles were using them. In theory, these measures should have been sufficient to prevent accidents. In practice, as the events of January 19, 1988 would demonstrate, they were inadequate. The procedures depended on communication, coordination and discipline, all of which could fail under the pressures of daily military operations. They also depended on assumptions that the military operations and railway traffic could be effectively separated in time and space, that tanks would not need to cross tracks when trains were approaching, that equipment would not break down at critical moments, that human error and mechanical failure would not coincide in catastrophic ways. The arrangement also reflected broader characteristics of life in East Germany and the Soviet military sphere. Safety was not prioritized the way it would be in Western countries. The Soviet military, operating in a foreign country where it answered primarily to Moscow rather than local authorities, did not face the same accountability for accidents that might affect civilians. And the East German government, dependent on Soviet support for its very existence, was in no position to demand that Soviet operations be constrained for civilian safety concerns. By January 1988, this arrangement had existed for over 4 decades without major incident. Thousands of trains had passed through Forst Zinna while thousands of tanks trained nearby. The system, flawed as it was, had functioned, but it had functioned not because it was well designed or inherently safe, but because disaster had not yet struck. And on the evening of January 19, the combination of circumstances that had been waiting to happen for 40 years finally occurred. The T-64 tank that would block the railway track and cause the disaster was a formidable piece of military hardware representing the cutting edge of Soviet tank design in the 1960s and 1970s. Understanding this tank and why it was at Forst Zinna is important to understanding the disaster. The T-64 was developed by the Soviet Union beginning in the early 1960s as a next-generation main battle tank. It incorporated numerous innovations that made it superior to earlier Soviet tanks and competitive with the best Western designs. The T-64 featured composite armor, layers of steel and ceramic materials that provided better protection than homogeneous steel armor of the same weight. It mounted a 125 mm smoothbore gun larger than the 105 mm guns on most NATO tanks of the era, giving it superior firepower. It had an automatic loading system that allowed a 3-man crew to operate the tank compared to the 4-man crews required by tanks with manual loading. The T-64 also had sophisticated fire control systems for its time, including laser rangefinders and ballistic computers that improved accuracy. It was powered by a compact opposed piston diesel engine that provided good power-to-weight ratio while being relatively fuel efficient. In many respects, the T-64 represented Soviet tank design at its peak, a well-armed, well-protected mobile platform that could challenge any NATO tank in combat. But the T-64 also had significant problems, many of which related to its complexity and the Soviet Union's difficulty in manufacturing and maintaining advanced technology reliably. The engine, while powerful and compact, was prone to breakdowns. The automatic loading system was complex and sometimes jammed. The transmission, which had to transfer power from the engine to the tracks while allowing the tank to turn and maneuver, was a particular weak point, complicated, temperamental, and prone to failure. These problems were well known within the Soviet military. The T-64's reliability issues were serious enough that the Soviet Union developed alternative tank designs, the T-72 and T-80, that were intended partly to provide more reliable alternatives to the problematic T-64. But the T-64 remained in production and service because it had superior armor and firepower, and because Soviet tank doctrine emphasized performance in combat over reliability in peacetime. By 1988, T-64 tanks had been deployed to Soviet forces in East Germany for training and potential combat operations. Forst Zinna, with its extensive tank training facilities, was a logical place to operate T-64s. Crews needed to learn how to operate these complex machines, how to maintain them, and how to fight with them. The training was demanding, involving both classroom instruction and extensive practical exercises driving and operating the tanks under various conditions. Tank crews would spend hours each day learning to maneuver their vehicles across the training grounds at Forst Zinna, practicing the skills they would need if war came: how to drive cross-country at speed, how to position the tank for optimal firing angles, how to coordinate with other tanks in formation, how to perform emergency repairs in field conditions. On January 19, 1988, a T-64 tank crew was conducting routine training exercises at Forst Zinna. The specific details of what training they were performing that day are not entirely clear from available records. The Soviet military did not publicize the circumstances, and East German authorities received only limited information about Soviet operations on the base. What is known is that at some point during the afternoon or early evening, the tank crew was tasked with moving their vehicle from one location to another within the base. This kind of movement was routine. Tanks regularly needed to be transported between different areas of the base, from maintenance facilities to training grounds, from storage areas to firing ranges, from one training area to another. The base had roads designed to accommodate tank traffic, with reinforced surfaces that could bear the weight of 40-ton vehicles and sufficient width to allow tanks to pass. But the route the tank crew needed to take on this particular evening required crossing the railway tracks. This too was not unprecedented. There were designated crossing points where military vehicles could cross the tracks, and procedures existed for coordinating such crossings with the railway operations. A tank crew intending to cross the tracks was supposed to notify the appropriate authorities, ensure that no trains were approaching, post guards at the crossing if necessary, and move across the tracks quickly to minimize the time the crossing was blocked. The exact circumstances of what happened next remain somewhat unclear, lost in the combination of Soviet military secrecy, East German government information control, and the simple chaos that follows any major accident. But what is certain is that the T-64 tank approached the railway crossing and began to cross the tracks, and then in the middle of the crossing, with the tank straddling both rails, something went catastrophically wrong with the tank's mechanical systems. The most likely explanation, based on the T-64's known mechanical problems and the circumstances of the accident, is that the tank's transmission failed. The transmission in a tracked vehicle is a complex piece of machinery that must channel power from the engine to the two tracks while allowing the tracks to rotate at different speeds for steering. The T-64's transmission was particularly sophisticated but also notoriously unreliable. When it failed, the tank could not move. The engine might run, the controls might respond, but the power could not be transferred to the tracks. This is apparently what happened in the middle of the railway crossing. The tank rolled onto the tracks, and then its transmission failed. The engine continued to run. The crew could operate the controls, but the tank would not move forward or backward. It was immobilized, sitting squarely across both tracks with its 40 tons of mass creating an immovable obstacle. The crew immediately recognized the danger. They were not inexperienced soldiers. Tank crews operating complex machines like the T-64 received extensive training and were generally competent professionals. They understood that a railway ran through the base, that trains used these tracks regularly, and that a tank blocking the tracks could cause a catastrophe. They attempted every technique they knew to get the tank moving. First, they would have tried the obvious solutions: shifting through the gears, manipulating the steering controls, attempting to rock the tank by alternating power to different tracks. When these didn't work, they would have tried more desperate measures. The crew might have attempted to diagnose and repair the transmission failure on the spot, though this would be extremely difficult under the pressure of the situation. They might have tried to contact base headquarters to request assistance, a tow vehicle, maintenance support, anything that could help move the tank off the tracks, but moving a 40-ton tank with a failed transmission is not a quick process. A properly equipped recovery vehicle might be able to tow it, but such vehicles would need to be summoned, would need to travel to the location, would need to be properly positioned and connected to the disabled tank. The entire process would take considerable time, likely at least 30 minutes, possibly much longer, and time was something the crew did not have. At some point, and exactly when this happened is not clear from available records, the crew heard a train approaching. The sound of a diesel locomotive and passenger coaches moving at high speed is distinctive and carries well, especially in the relative quiet of a winter evening in a forested area. The crew would have heard the train while it was still some distance away, giving them perhaps a minute or two of warning. But a minute is nothing when trying to move a disabled 40-ton tank. The crew tried even more frantically to move the tank. They attempted every control, every possible technique. Some accounts suggest they even tried to abandon the tank and flag down the train, though whether this is true and whether they had sufficient time to do so is unclear. What is certain is that despite their efforts, the tank remained immobile on the tracks as the train approached. In the locomotive of the express train, the engineer was maintaining his scheduled speed on the familiar route. The train had departed from its origin station on time and was making good progress toward its destination. The coaches were carrying commuters, working people heading home after a day at factories, offices, or shops. Some passengers were reading newspapers or books. Others were conversing with fellow travelers. Some were simply staring out the windows at the darkened winter landscape, thinking about dinner or evening plans or the routines of daily life. The engineer knew this route intimately. He had driven this line hundreds or thousands of times. He knew where the signals were, where the curves and grades lay, where the stations were located. He knew that the railway passed through Forst Zinna military base, and that Soviet tanks sometimes operated near the tracks. But in all his years of running this route, he had never encountered a tank blocking the tracks. The procedures that were supposed to prevent such an occurrence had always worked. Until now. The train rounded a gentle curve, and suddenly the engineer saw something massive blocking both tracks ahead. In the darkness, illuminated only by the train's headlight, he had perhaps 3 seconds to comprehend what he was seeing and react. His training took over instantly. His hand slammed the emergency brake lever, engaging the full braking power of the train's air brake system. The air brakes on a train work by releasing compressed air from brake cylinders, which causes brake shoes to press against the wheels with tremendous force. It is a powerful system, capable of stopping even heavy trains, but it is not instantaneous. The brake signal must travel through the air brake lines from the locomotive to each car. The brake shoes must engage, the wheels must grip the rails and transfer braking force through friction. All of this takes time and distance that the engineer simply did not have. The physics of stopping a train are unforgiving. A train consists of a locomotive and multiple cars, together weighing hundreds of tons. When traveling at 90 km per hour, this mass possesses enormous kinetic energy, the energy of motion that must be dissipated through friction before the train can stop. Even with full emergency braking, a train traveling at this speed requires several hundred meters to come to a complete stop under ideal conditions. On this winter evening, with possibly icy rails, the stopping distance would be even greater. The engineer had approximately 200 meters between his position when he saw the tank and the point of impact. It was not nearly enough. The locomotive struck the T-64 tank at tremendous speed, probably still traveling at 70 or 80 km per hour, despite the emergency braking. The force of the collision was apocalyptic. 40 tons of tank met hundreds of tons of train, both moving with the kinetic energy of their mass and velocity, the laws of physics applied with absolute indifference to the human consequences. The impact crushed the front of the locomotive, crumpling steel and shattering the frame. The tank, despite its mass and armor, was hurled off the tracks by the force of the collision. The 40-ton armored vehicle was thrown sideways, smashing into an adjacent building, likely one of the military structures that stood near the tracks within Forst Zinna. The tank's armor protected its crew from the impact to some degree, but the violence of being struck by a train at highway speed and hurled into a building subjected them to forces far beyond what the human body can withstand. The fate of the tank crew is not documented in available records, but it is difficult to imagine they survived. The locomotive, its front end destroyed and its forward wheels derailed by the impact, began to tip and slide. The massive weight of the engine, no longer supported by rails on both sides, pulled the locomotive off the tracks. The derailment occurred at high speed, with the locomotive's tremendous momentum causing it to slide and roll, tearing up track and scattering debris. Behind the locomotive, the passenger coaches were still traveling at high speed. The emergency braking had reduced their velocity somewhat, but not enough to prevent catastrophe. The lead coach, still moving at perhaps 60 or 70 kilometers per hour, crashed into the derailed locomotive. The coach's wooden and steel frame was no match for the forces involved. The front of the coach crumpled, collapsing inward and crushing passengers in the forward seats. The second coach crashed into the first, adding its momentum to the devastation. The cars behind continued to pile up, each one crashing into the wreckage of the cars ahead. This accordion effect, where the rear cars of a train crash into the cars ahead during a derailment, is one of the most deadly aspects of train accidents. Passengers in the rear cars who might have survived the initial impact with the obstacle find themselves crushed as the cars behind them continue forward and compress the wreckage. The wooden bodies of the passenger coaches splintered and broke apart under the forces involved. Metal frames bent and twisted, windows shattered, sending glass fragments through the air like shrapnel. Seats were torn loose from their moorings, luggage racks collapsed, the lighting failed, plunging the wreckage into darkness punctuated only by the sparks from severed electrical lines and the flames from fuel that had ignited during the crash. Inside the coaches, passengers experienced violence beyond description. Those in the forward cars were subjected to deceleration forces far beyond what the human body can survive. Passengers who were seated were thrown forward against the seats ahead or against walls and doors. Those who were standing were hurled through the air like projectiles. The structural collapse of the coaches crushed passengers where they sat or stood. Bodies were thrown through shattered windows, limbs were severed by twisted metal. The injuries were catastrophic, multiple trauma, crushing injuries, massive internal bleeding, traumatic amputations, severe burns from fires that broke out in the wreckage. Some passengers were killed instantly by the violence of the impacts. Others survived the initial crash but were trapped in the wreckage, injured and unable to escape. Still others escaped with relatively minor injuries through some combination of luck, positioning, and the random nature of catastrophic accidents. A passenger might survive unscathed because they happened to be in a section of a coach that remained relatively intact, while someone in the next row died from crushing injuries. The train, which moments before had been a functioning transportation system carrying people home from work, was now a scattered field of wreckage extending hundreds of meters along the tracks and into the areas adjacent to the railway. The locomotive lay on its side, its front end completely destroyed. Several coaches had derailed and lay at angles to the track, their bodies crushed and splintered. Other coaches remained more or less on the rails but were compressed and damaged from the accordion collisions. The tank that had started this catastrophe lay smashed against a building, barely recognizable as a military vehicle. The silence after the crash was eerie and terrible, the screaming of metal on metal during the collision, the shattering of glass, the grinding of derailing wheels. All of these sounds stopped, replaced by a moment of awful quiet, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam, the crackle of fires beginning to spread, and then the screams of injured passengers trapped in the wreckage. The accident occurred within the boundaries of Forst Zinna military base, meaning that Soviet soldiers were nearby and responded quickly to the scene. Within minutes, Soviet military personnel were at the wreckage, attempting to help survivors and coordinate rescue efforts. But the scene they encountered was beyond their training or experience. Soviet soldiers were trained for combat operations, for responding to military emergencies, for dealing with casualties in battlefield conditions. They were not trained for mass casualty civilian railway accidents. The wreckage was complex and dangerous, twisted metal that could collapse further, fires that threatened to spread, injured people trapped in positions that required careful extraction to avoid causing additional harm. East German emergency services were also summoned to the scene. Fire brigades, ambulance services and police responded from the surrounding area, but accessing the accident site presented immediate problems. The crash had occurred on Soviet military territory, which was technically off-limits to German authorities without Soviet permission. The Soviets had to grant access before German emergency services could even enter the base to reach the wreckage. This coordination took precious time, during which injured passengers remained trapped. Even once German emergency services reached the scene, they faced a chaotic and dangerous environment. The wreckage was extensive and structurally unstable. Fires had broken out in multiple locations and threatened to spread to fuel tanks and other flammable materials. Injured passengers were scattered throughout the wreckage, some trapped by collapsed structures that would require cutting equipment to remove. The darkness and winter cold complicated everything. Rescuers needed lighting to work, but electric power was unavailable in the wreckage, requiring portable generators and lights. The cold meant that injured passengers were at risk of hypothermia, particularly those who were trapped and could not move to stay warm. The rescue operation continued through the night and into the following day. Firefighters worked to extinguish the blazes and prevent them from spreading to sections of wreckage where survivors might be trapped. Rescue teams cut through twisted metal to reach trapped passengers. Medical personnel provided emergency treatment to the injured, stabilizing them for transport to hospitals. Recovery workers removed bodies from the wreckage, grim work that had to be done carefully to preserve evidence for the subsequent investigation and to treat the deceased with dignity. The final casualty count was 6 dead and 33 injured. By the standards of major train disasters, this was not an extraordinarily high death toll. Railway accidents have killed hundreds or even thousands when circumstances are particularly catastrophic. But every death in an avoidable accident is a tragedy, and the Forst Zinna disaster was entirely avoidable. The deaths and injuries resulted not from some unforeseeable act of God or unavoidable mechanical failure, but from a combination of poor planning, inadequate procedures, and the dangerous consequences of allowing military operations and civilian transportation to share the same space without adequate safeguards. The 6 people who died were East German citizens, commuters who had simply been trying to get home from work on a Tuesday evening in January. They had boarded an express train, expecting a routine journey that would get them home for dinner with their families. Instead, they became casualties of a disaster that never should have happened, killed by a tank that never should have been on the railway tracks. The 33 injured suffered various degrees of trauma. Some had relatively minor injuries, cuts, bruises, minor fractures that would heal with time. Others suffered serious injuries requiring hospitalization, surgery, and long recovery periods. Some likely carried permanent disabilities from their injuries, chronic pain, limited mobility, psychological trauma. These were people whose lives were permanently altered by the few seconds of violence when train met tank. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, both Soviet military authorities and the East German government moved quickly to control information about what had happened. This was standard practice in the German Democratic Republic, where the government maintained strict control over media and public information. Bad news, particularly news that might reflect poorly on the Soviet military or on the East German government's relationship with its Soviet occupiers, was routinely suppressed, minimized, or spun to serve political purposes. Initial reports about the accident were minimal and vague. The East German news agency ADN issued a brief statement acknowledging that a serious railway accident had occurred at Forst Zinna, resulting in casualties. The statement provided few details about the cause of the accident, the number of casualties, or the circumstances. East German newspapers published short articles about the accident, but these articles contained little substantive information and certainly did not mention that the cause was a Soviet tank blocking the tracks. This information suppression reflected the sensitive political nature of the accident. The crash had occurred on Soviet military property and was caused by Soviet military equipment. Any thorough investigation or public discussion of the accident would necessarily involve examining Soviet military operations, questioning Soviet procedures, and potentially criticizing the Soviet military for the failures that led to the disaster. This was politically unacceptable to both Soviet authorities, who did not want their military operations scrutinized or criticized, and to East German authorities, who depended on Soviet support for their regime's survival and could not afford to antagonize Moscow. The suppression was also tactical. The East German government feared that detailed reporting about the accident might spark public anger or criticism. East Germans had long resented the Soviet military presence in their country, the occupation forces that had arrived in 1945 and never left, the bases that covered significant portions of East German territory, the military operations that took precedence over civilian needs. An accident where a Soviet tank killed East German civilians would naturally provoke anger and could potentially lead to protests or civil unrest that the government wanted to avoid, so the information flow was carefully managed. Foreign journalists were denied access to the accident site and were given minimal information. East German citizens who tried to discuss the accident openly or to ask questions about what had happened were discouraged by police and state security services. Survivors and witnesses were interviewed by authorities but were apparently warned against speaking publicly about what they had experienced. The combination of government control over media, police powers to suppress information, and the general atmosphere of surveillance and control in East Germany meant that detailed information about the accident did not emerge publicly for years. But information suppression could not erase what had happened or prevent some details from eventually emerging. People had witnessed the accident or its aftermath. Survivors had experienced the crash and would carry those memories. Emergency responders had seen the wreckage and the casualties. Despite government efforts to control information, stories circulated through informal channels, people talking quietly to family and friends, witnesses sharing what they had seen, rumors spreading through communities. Over time, particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the East German regime in 1989 to 1990, more complete information about the Forst Zinna disaster emerged. Records that had been classified or suppressed became available to historians and journalists. Survivors felt free to speak openly about their experiences without fear of government retaliation. Investigators could examine evidence and interview witnesses without political constraints. The full story of what happened on January 19, 1988, gradually came into focus. The investigation into the accident, conducted by both Soviet military authorities and East German railway officials, identified multiple contributing factors. The immediate cause was clear: a tank had blocked the railway tracks and a train had struck it. But why was the tank on the tracks? Why had the train not been warned? What procedures were supposed to prevent such accidents and why did they fail? The investigation found that communication and coordination between the Soviet military authorities and the East German railway officials had broken down. The tank crew had apparently not properly notified the appropriate authorities that they were crossing the tracks, or the notification had not reached the railway controllers who could have stopped train traffic. The procedures that were supposed to prevent conflicts between military vehicles crossing the tracks and train traffic had failed, either because they were not followed correctly or because they were inadequate for the situation. The tank's mechanical failure was also significant. Had the transmission not failed while the tank was on the tracks, the crew would have driven across and cleared the crossing before any train approached. But the T-64's notorious mechanical unreliability meant that such failures were not rare occurrences. The Soviet military was operating equipment with known reliability problems in an environment where a breakdown could have catastrophic civilian consequences, but had not implemented sufficient safeguards to prevent disasters when inevitable mechanical failures occurred. The investigation also identified systemic problems with how the Soviet military base and the civilian railway coexisted. The fundamental issue was that military operations and civilian transportation were sharing the same space with inadequate separation and coordination. The railway ran through the middle of an active military base where tanks and other heavy equipment were constantly moving. The opportunities for conflict were continuous and the procedures for preventing conflicts were inadequate. The Forst Zinna disaster was not an unforeseeable accident but rather the inevitable result of a dangerous situation that had been allowed to persist for decades. Recommendations from the investigation likely included improving communication between military and railway authorities, enhancing procedures for coordinating military vehicle crossings with train schedules, possibly rerouting the railway to avoid the military base, or implementing better warning systems at crossings. But the extent to which these recommendations were implemented is unclear. The Soviet military was not particularly accountable to East German authorities, and compelling the Soviets to change their operational procedures or to accommodate civilian safety concerns was politically difficult for the East German government. What is certain is that the arrangement at Forst Zinna, with civilian railway traffic running through the middle of an active Soviet military base, continued until the Soviet withdrawal from East Germany beginning in 1989. For over a year after the disaster, trains continued to run past Soviet tanks at Forst Zinna, with whatever improved procedures may have been implemented after the accident being the only barrier against another catastrophe. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 began a process that would end Soviet military presence in East Germany. As the Cold War concluded and Germany moved toward reunification, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its forces from what had been East Germany. The withdrawal was a massive undertaking. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and enormous quantities of military equipment had to be transported back to the USSR. Forst Zinna, as one of the largest Soviet bases in East Germany, was a major node in this withdrawal process. By 1994, the last Soviet soldiers had departed from Forst Zinna. The base that had been a Soviet military installation for nearly 50 years became German property once again. The question of what to do with the massive complex then arose. The base included hundreds of buildings, extensive infrastructure, and occupied hundreds of hectares of land. But much of it was in poor condition. Decades of military use had left buildings and facilities deteriorated, and Soviet departure had left behind contamination and debris. Some portions of the former base have been redeveloped for civilian use. Buildings have been converted into housing, businesses, or community facilities. Some areas have been remediated and repurposed. But large sections of Forst Zinna remain abandoned, slowly decaying as nature reclaims the land. The barracks that once housed Soviet soldiers stand empty, their windows broken and their roofs collapsing. Tank maintenance facilities rust in silence. The training grounds where T-64 once maneuvered are overgrown with vegetation. The railway line that was the site of the 1988 disaster continues to operate, though its route has been modified in places. Trains still run through what was once Forst Zinna, carrying passengers and freight, but they no longer face the risk of encountering Soviet tanks on the tracks. The location of the accident is not marked by any memorial or sign. The event has faded into history, known primarily to those who experienced it, studied it, or maintained interest in Cold War history and railway disasters. For the families of those who died in the Forst Zinna disaster, the passage of time has not erased the loss. 6 people died in an accident that never should have happened, killed by the consequences of political and military arrangements that prioritized Soviet military operations over civilian safety. Their deaths were not heroic sacrifices for some greater cause, but simply tragic and avoidable losses, the price paid when military power operates without adequate accountability, and when the machinery of war shares space with ordinary life. The Forst Zinna rail disaster stands as one of many Cold War tragedies that remained largely hidden or forgotten. It was not a dramatic confrontation between East and West, not a spy thriller or a political crisis. It was simply a train hitting a tank, a mechanical failure leading to civilian deaths, a disaster that occurred because systems that should have prevented it failed. But in its own way, the disaster illuminates the nature of life in East Germany under Soviet occupation, the constraints on information, the primacy of military considerations over civilian concerns, the tensions between German authorities and Soviet forces, and the human costs of political arrangements imposed by force. The story of Forst Zinna is also the story of how infrastructure designed for one era can become dangerous when circumstances change. The railway was built in the 19th century, when the area was less militarized. The military base expanded in the 20th century without fundamentally changing the railway's route. By the 1980s, civilian trains and Soviet tanks were sharing space in ways the original planners never imagined and never designed for. The disaster was the consequence of this mismatch: old infrastructure, new uses, inadequate adaptation, and insufficient safeguards, creating conditions where catastrophe became possible and eventually inevitable. Today, the former Forst Zinna base stands as a monument to a vanished era. The Cold War that brought Soviet forces to this corner of Brandenburg is over. The tanks are gone. The soldiers have departed. The base that once trained thousands of Soviet tank crews for potential war in Europe now lies largely abandoned, slowly returning to the forest. But the memory of January 19, 1988, remains: 6 lives lost, 33 injured, and a disaster that demonstrated the deadly consequences when the machinery of military power and the routines of civilian life collide without adequate safeguards or accountability.